In today's Farm Report, organic agriculture faces challenges when it comes to controlling pests due to the inability to use herbicides or other chemicals on their crops. But, as Rod Bain with the U.S. Department of Agriculture reports, USDA research and research at land-grant universities is looking at ways to help farmers.
The organic sector, perhaps more so than any area of agriculture, is reliant on research developments. Why?
Those producers are exposed to all manner of constraints.
National Institute of Food and Agriculture Director Sunny Ramaswamy says on top of natural constraints such as climate, organic producers do not have options such as pesticides, fertilizers, or genetically modified crops to help control pest, disease, or low soil nutrient content. That is why USDA is behind organic research projects at land-grant universities and its agricultural research service stations. Ramaswamy provides some examples of this effort. First,
apples are subject to some pathogens. In addition to those wormy apples, you end up getting those misshapen apples. Oftentimes you might have diseases that are fungal pathogens or bacterial pathogens that could impact the production of apples.
So to combat these pathogens, conventional apple growers use a common antibiotic.
In the organic production systems as well, we need to wean the producers away from utilizing these sorts of tools to deal with their pathogen problems. So we provided funding here about 3 years ago to some individuals that have a project on trying to discover alternative methods.
Organic production system crops also are more reliant on crossbreeding.
The crops that are going to be grown organically need to be bred to have traits in them that would allow them to withstand the pressures of insects or pathogens, or be able to grow even in the situation of not having enough chemical fertilizers.
Ramaswamy provides an example of research in that regard.
We have provided funding for a project out of the University of Wisconsin where they're developing new varieties of carrots that are very specifically bred to be grown in organic systems.
There is concern within the organic community that pollen from genetically modified crops may accidentally be spread and pollinate organic flowers.
You may be growing organic corn next to GMO corn, and your organic corn may be susceptible to this pollen coming from this GMO corn.
A research project underway at North Carolina State University is figuring out how to prevent this accidental pollination.
It's a really cool project, and I think it's going to have very significant impact on how we view how to grow these crops. There's this concept called coexistence, the production of both organic and non-organic production systems, particularly the utilization of technologies like GMOs, for example. This offers an opportunity that both sets of growers can coexist.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
The Agriculture Department is streamlining, speeding up the process to get new biotech crops tested and deregulated for use by farmers. Kevin Shea runs the USDA agency in charge of that process, which has been criticized in the past for being too slow. He told a congressional panel that the backlog for approvals has been rapidly reduced in the last 2 years. There were 34 in the queue a couple of years ago, but now
there are only 6 remaining. We're going to get those done, we think, by the end of this fiscal year. And so now we have the system in equilibrium. We can handle the amount that come in. And not only can we handle them, we can handle them quicker. It was taking us 3 to 5 years to do these things. We are now down to 15 to 18 months.
With a goal of making the max time all the time for the deregulation process at 15 months. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
As many producers know, good veterinary care can be a critical part of the operation for any livestock producer, but in many areas that are underserved by veterinarians, they may be far away and unable to respond if an issue arises. As Rod Bain with the U.S. Department of Agriculture reports, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is looking to change that.
If you raise food animals, livestock or poultry, and the things they produce like milk and eggs, it's important to have veterinary service close by. But as Gary Sherman of USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture points out,
we have vast stretches of central United States where there are more animals than there are people in most of the counties, and those animals need care, and our national biosecurity needs protection against catastrophic diseases such as foot and mouth disease and mad cow disease and avian influenza. And so having eyes and ears of veterinarians out there to provide day-to-day service, but also to protect the nation and the food supply is really key.
Yet there has been a shortage of veterinarians in these areas, in part because of significant veterinary school student loans. Sherman says this has forced many students who wanted a career as a food animal veterinarian to move into a more lucrative part of the field to pay down those debts. And that is what led to the creation of the Veterinary Medicine Loan Repayment Program, which NEFA oversees.
This is a competitive program, so there are over 200 shortage situations that are designated by state animal health officials around the country. We have over 150 applications from veterinarians each year, and we have enough money to support 40 to 50 awardees.
So the program works like this. Selected applicants serve as veterinarians in underserved areas of the country, with an emphasis on food animals. For a minimum of 3 years of service, NEFA assists these aspiring veterinarians with repayment of their loans, with the amount perhaps as much as $25,000 each year.
Essentially, that program got up and going in 2010, and since that time, we have placed about 250 veterinarians in high-priority shortage areas around the country and allowed them to pursue their desire to carry on with food supply veterinary medicine at the same time as meeting the needs as stipulated in each state.
Sherman adds these students can renew their contracts under this program if they desire. NEFA is currently conducting surveys among participants to determine retention rates and other items. But he believes, based on support by lawmakers and participants alike,
from the standpoint of universal appeal, I think that this program has that going for it.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
It may be meteorological spring, but apparently March didn't get that memo.
It still seems like winter out there for much of the central and eastern United States.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey.
We've gone through a lot of wintry weather here in February and early March, and it continues. And looks like a pretty significant late-season storm unfolding on March 4th and 5th, all the way from the Ozark Plateau northeastward through the Tennessee Valley and into the mid-Atlantic states and even southern New England.
That storm will feature heavy snow, heavy sleet, and even some freezing rain.
Only on the southern fringes of the system will we see significant rainfall, but even that could be enough to cause some flooding, especially in areas where we picked up some heavy snow in late February across the south.
The good thing, the storm is confined to a narrow band.
The entire precipitation shield should stretch from northeastern Texas into the northern mid-Atlantic. We're expecting 1 to 3 inches of precipitation.
So one more final big blow of winter for some areas across the south into the mid-Atlantic states. For USDA Radio, Susan Carter, Washington, D.C.
The USDA's Census of Agriculture looked at what farmers were producing, whether it be soybeans and corn, or specialty crops like nuts. Rod Bain with the U.S. Department of Agriculture looks at how the nuts and specialty crops came out in the census.
How many farmers are growing fruits, vegetables, tree nuts, and nursery crops? What are they growing and where? A USDA report gleaning information from the 2012 Census of Agriculture focuses on specialty crops.
What we've done is we've looked at the Specialty Crops Competitive Act of 2004, and the way it's defined in there is fruits and vegetables, tree nuts, dried fruits, and horticulture and nursery crops, which would include floriculture. And by the time you break that down by commodity, you get a fairly long list of crops that are included in there.
Lance Honig of the National Agricultural Statistics Service goes inside the numbers of this special Specialty Crop Census of Ag report.
What we found in the 2012 edition is that the number of farms growing specialty crops in the U.S. was actually down about 1% from what we found back in 2007, which of course was the previous census.
Yet Honig says total specialty crop acreage was up 2% from the previous census.
So it's similar to a trend that we see across much of agriculture where you see the number of operations or number of farms going down, but that doesn't necessarily translate to fewer acres or lower production.
Nursery, greenhouse, and floriculture crops noted the largest categorical increase in farms producing specialty crops from the last census.
In fact, up nearly 24% in the number of farms that were producing those, again, nursery, greenhouse, and floriculture crops. So that's really where we saw the biggest shift.
Now looking at Census of Ag specialty crop numbers by demographics,
92% of those operations define themselves as being operated by either a family, individual partnership, or family-held corporation. So these are definitely family-type operations that are producing specialty crops. We also know about 15% of the principal operators are females, which is just a little bit higher than what we saw across all census farms.
and as for some of the highlights by state,
we saw a 340,000 acre increase in specialty crops compared back to 2007 in California. That's nearly a 9% increase. Washington increasing more than 68,000 acres.
while Florida reported a nearly 8% decline in acreage. And
If you look at that specialty crop definition, you include the pulse crops. And in pulse crops, we saw a big increase in Montana.
More highlights from the 2012 Census of Agriculture Specialty Crops Report can be found online at www.agcensus, all one word, .usda.gov. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
In the middle part of the country, temperatures all over the place, ranging from sub-zero levels to even the 70s and 80s at times in terms of temperatures. For the most part, precipitation's been adequate. And then you move to the east and the west, and we have seen, for the most part, persistent cold, especially late in the winter across the east. And we've seen chronic warmth, which remains an issue with the drought ongoing in places like California, the Great Basin.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says February seemed to sharpen some of those extremes.
We, in fact, saw record-setting February temperatures in many locations across the West, all the way stretching from Seattle, Washington, down through Portland and into Las Vegas. Temperatures running anywhere from 5 to 10 degrees above February averages in those cities and elsewhere in the West.
The Great Lakes states into the northeast saw historic cold.
Marquette, Michigan, Hartford, Connecticut, and Bangor, Maine. It was the coldest month ever.
For USDA Radio, Susan Carter, Washington.